You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
It's Friday, April 19th, and this week we're talking about severe weather. It's something that can impact your life in a minute, but you probably don't know everything that goes into making sure you're prepared when that minute comes. The last few words of a news story are referred to as the outcue, and that's where this podcast gets its name, because often what you see on television is only a part of the story. This is the outcue, and with us today, I'm Assistant News Director Breen Mitchell, and with us today is Chief Meteorologist Eric Wilhelm and Chris Cerenelli, and we're just going to get started. This week has been a wild week with tornadoes touching down in Trumbull County and parts nearby and other parts of Ohio, and it was another stark reminder of how quickly these things you hear about in the abstract can become very, very real very, very quickly. But it doesn't all happen that fast in reality, and in some ways I suppose it does. So I just want to start by talking, let's start long before there are watches or warnings, and just talk about what the weather department does day in and day out leading up to a storm, and when you kind of know something should be on your radar and what you're watching.
It just sort of depends on what time of year we're talking about and what type of setup it is. We have two kinds of storm days in our area. One is those kind of summertime popcorn storms that just kind of come out of nowhere, and those we don't necessarily know are coming more than a handful of minutes ahead of time. A lot of times, though, we have days notice where the atmosphere looks like it's ready to produce, and we've seen a few of those days so far this year, only one of which has really produced much severe weather. We've had a couple of other instances in which we had a pretty high risk that just didn't really pan out, but usually we have several days where we're really keeping an eye on things beforehand.
Yeah.
And as far as the forecasting goes, it starts with just looking at the data. We see trends in the long term. People always talk about, what's the weather going to be like 6 weeks from now? There's no way for us to know that, but we can see general trends in the longer range. And then when the event kind of gets a little bit closer, we can fine tune a little more of the details. And when it comes to severe weather, sometimes the ingredients don't appear to come together until the day of.
Yep.
The atmosphere just kind of throws us a few curveballs, and then the day of, we'll see, wow, we're looking at what's happening upstairs, and it turns out there really is a potential for something to break here.
And even then, there's a lot that's variable sometimes. Like I know sometimes we'll get, Eric, you'll send out emails to us as to what to watch for and what to expect. And it'll be things like, well, I think the term that sometimes we'll use is the atmosphere is juiced. Like something could happen, but then is it cloudy, and does that keep the temperature down, and what is that? So I mean, talk about some of those variables that people might not understand.
We sometimes use an analogy. It's like baking cupcakes. You can have the great ingredients, but if one of those ingredients is a little off, if you have too much sugar or something else, then your cupcakes aren't going to come together just right. So in order to have a true severe weather setup that really actually produces storms that bring wind damage and tornadoes and hail and things like that, you need all your ingredients to be just right. And more often than not, there's one of those ingredients that isn't quite right. And while we might have some rain and some storms, true severe weather doesn't materialize if things aren't just right.
Absolutely. Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it always seems like there is one variable that's not quite, the timing's not right. The passage of a trough or a disturbance or a front is not quite favorable enough during peak heating of the day. Or we have too much cloud cover early in the day that holds instability down. And, that becomes hard when you're trying to communicate that effectively to the public, because they hear the word severe weather, they expect a worst case scenario, and then when it doesn't happen, it's almost like they're disappointed. Mm-hmm. And they get frustrated because, it's the whole cry wolf thing, but that's why we're very careful. I know, Eric is, and everybody else here in the weather department, we're very selective in our language in trying to communicate this. We're not going to tell you that it's going to happen. We're telling you that the conditions are right, and be prepared in case it does.
Absolutely. So now all the predictions, let's take it to a night like this past Wednesday. So we're past prediction territory, we're into reality territory. Just take us to what's it like in the weather office, in the field, when this really is now, it's not just hypothetical, stuff is happening.
In some ways, the situation from Wednesday was one of our easier situations from a communications standpoint and also a prediction standpoint, because it was just one line of storms that just was going to come through and then it was going to be over. This wasn't a situation where there was going to be random pop-up storms here and there. This wasn't a situation in which there was going to be waves and waves of storms, and some places might have 4 storms in one night. This was just a situation in which a well-predicted, well-timed squall line was going to move through. And so on a day like that, we can, with a fair amount of confidence, nail down the timing, give people a window. Hey, it's going to be 6 to 8 p.m. In any one location. The worst weather is probably going to last 15 minutes, and then you'll be done. That's, in some ways, a lot easier to communicate than those days where we're kind of almost not guessing. I don't want to use the word guessing, but giving people a heads up that there could be storms, but we can't say it's going to storm in your backyard, but not your backyard. The situation from Wednesday was everyone's going to see storms. It's just a matter of will anyone see severe weather, and that was still kind of a question mark.
Yeah.
We use a word a lot in severe weather in that sphere called mesoscale, on the small scale. So we'll talk about there can be a set of conditions in Trumbull County that's a little bit different from the set of conditions in Columbiana County. You may have an outflow boundary that acts like a mini cold front that a storm hours and hours ago produced and left this little boundary that acts like a lifting mechanism that can cause a storm in one county and not another one. So when you're talking about severe weather, you hear that word a lot, the mesoscale, and all weather is local. But when you're talking about severe weather, it really becomes a big player when you look at things from that perspective.
And from the communication standpoint, Chris mentioned the cry wolf syndrome. We have to balance that with knowing that there's a certain segment of our audience who also are very storm anxious. And any mention of a possibility of thunderstorms and severe weather, and we'll get messages on social media and Facebook especially from some people who are just really anxious. And so we don't want to panic people. We never want to panic anybody. We want to prepare but not be scared. But we also can't ignore threats. We have to talk about, hey, here's the possibilities, and just be calm and measured and use the right language so that you're not adding to some people's concerns, but also not kind of poo-pooing, if you will, a little bit too much.
And you guys are excellent about walking that line, because I imagine that particularly when it's happening and you're watching this, these have to be tense moments. I mean, I know what covering breaking news is like. This is comparable to that. It's not an easy thing to say, look, this is sensationalistic, but this is downplaying, and I've got to strike that line in the middle.
It is a challenge. And, just to use this weekend as an example, on Wednesday evening, we were doing live coverage on TV with a tornado warning in Trumbull County. We had a pretty good signature on the radar that was strongly suggestive that there might have been a tornado on the ground. But standing in a studio looking at a camera without having someone on the ground right in that exact spot, we don't know if there's actually a tornado on the ground. And so we have to try to, again, strike the balance between saying this is possible, but at the same time not saying there's definitely a tornado on the ground, you have to seek shelter right now. We can't really do that in a lot of situations.
That's one of the reasons that I kind of went into chase mode. I was actually in Vienna covering a news story that night, and just before the meeting was supposed to start, we had the tornado warning come out, and as I'm following this thing on the radar, I'm like, if I travel this particular corridor, I might be able to see this thing and give confirmation. So that's kind of what I did. We changed course a little bit, and so I went north and a little bit west up toward the Fowler area, and because if I took this certain route, I could see where the circulation and the rotation would be from a safe place, of course. I want to make sure I include that caveat there. I would never do something that reckless, certainly not in a vehicle that wasn't my own. But there's a strategy and there's a method to chasing severe weather and pursuing severe weather for the public safety, and that's kind of the mode that I went into. By the time I got up to where the circulation was, it had weakened a lot, and then it became going back to the neighborhoods that it had impacted before and looking for damage and looking, to make sure that everybody there was okay.
And what Chris was doing is very valuable to us, because we show these maps, we show these radars, but to the average person, to the lay person, it looks like a bucket of spilled paint on the screen. All these reds and greens and stuff, and I can try to explain the best I can that this green next to red means there might be a circulation, but to actually have eyeballs on the ground is really, really invaluable. And sometimes we can't do it, but when we can, it's really helpful.
Oh yeah, I mean we've all been somewhere, where you're with family and you're trying to look at radar, but basically all we're ever saying is, "Uh-oh, I see red." That's all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And without some context, that's of limited value.
Yes.
And now another thing that I wanted to kind of bring up, because I know I've heard you guys say this many times, is we get sometimes hung up on specific classifications, but wind is wind. I mean, damage is damage. So straight line winds versus tornadoes, people will go, there had to have been a tornado here. Look at this damage. Talk about why that is or isn't relevant.
We hear certain phrases and certain sentiments in every severe weather episode, especially if there's damage. There was definitely a tornado from this, and most of the time there wasn't. Tornadoes happen around here, but actually straight line thunderstorm winds are way, way more common. But yeah, wind is wind. A 75-mile-per-hour wind gust, whether it be from a tornado or not, is still going to bring down your tree the same way. Your tree doesn't care if it was a tornado or not. Your siding doesn't care. Your trampoline that went flying and went into a pole doesn't care if it was a tornado or not. So we want people to take severe thunderstorm warnings, especially those higher-end severe thunderstorm warnings, pretty seriously, because they can do the same kind of thing as a tornado.
That's something that Eric and I talked about from my story at 11 o'clock last night on Thursday night, these different categories. And only in recent years has the National Weather Service gone ahead and implemented this a little bit more detailed and explicit language when they issue warnings. There is your severe thunderstorm warning, and then there's a considerable threat. Then there is a destructive tag that they'll put on it if there's particularly large hail. Particularly strong wind gusts. I believe it's over 80 miles an hour is the threshold for that. And then in a tornado warning, and I don't think that's ever been used around here until the other night, this is a life-threatening situation, was the tag that they included in the Trumbull County tornado warning, because they had enough evidence based on the radar. There was a debris signature on the radar at one point that there was very likely a tornado on the ground that could pose a threat to life and property.
Yep.
Now, what do you think some of the most common misconceptions that you get from viewers? We're obviously talking about some of them right now, but what do you wish that they understood that they don't? I'll go first. If there's a tornado warning and your favorite show was interrupted, don't call the newsroom. You will not meet a sympathetic ear.
That's right. In fact, it's a law that we have to get on the air when there's a tornado warning and stay on the air until the end of that tornado warning in our viewing area. And I've been lucky in my time here at 21 News. I haven't had too many instances where I've had to interrupt football or something really, really big. It's a lot of times we're interrupting programming that is in the middle of the afternoon, or it's early in the evening, and not as much during true prime time when there's more eyeballs. And so I haven't gotten a lot of hate mail for that. Some, but not a lot. That's certainly one of them. Another one is the siren mentality. We fight against this all the time. Yes. The idea that this World War II technology is the be-all, end-all for some people, as far as if they hear a siren, oh, there must be a tornado. If they don't hear a siren, oh, there's no tornado, there's no threat. And so we have a kind of a siren discourse after every single severe weather event. Sirens here, but not here. And we hear all the time about sirens being set off in communities that were never, ever under any risk of seeing a tornado. We had that, of course, the other night. Sirens were being set off in communities that were nowhere near the tornado warning. And that can be a problem. Some people think that there's no harm in over warnings. Okay, the sirens went off. That's good. They worked fine. But there can be a cry wolf syndrome that occurs with that. If people hear sirens all the time and nothing ever happens, they're going to take them less seriously.
Sure.
And so it's something we fight against all the time. There are many, many better ways of getting warnings here in 2024. Sirens are way down on the list of best methods, for sure.
And in a siren, or if a siren goes off in an area that's not necessarily under a threat, people say when they hear the word severe weather, they expect a big wide swath, and this is why I said severe weather is very local. They expect that if their county is under a warning, that they expect to lose their roof, or they expect some kind of activity in their backyard. Very often that's not the case. And so that's something that they kind of need to get a little bit of perspective on is, you should be thankful. I was telling someone the other day, they were kind of talking about getting clicks and stuff on Facebook. And I said, you should be happy that you didn't lose a roof, or that you didn't have damage to your house, or worse. And, that goes back to interrupting your favorite show. One of my favorite kind of clapbacks that a meteorologist ever gave to somebody who was complaining about interrupting a show was, well, I'm sorry you missed this episode of such and such, so maybe you can go over to your neighbor's house, or your neighbors who lost their who lost their house can come over and watch it at your house since your house is still standing.
Right.
It's like a little humanity here.
Yeah.
You know, it's unfortunately a very selfish kind of mindset there.
It is.
Yeah, people live in their kind of little bubbles because I mean, what we'll hear a lot is, you guys sensationalize for ratings.
Right.
A system that they don't understand, and not that you need to. If you don't work in TV, you don't really understand how ratings work. You just know it as a term. And there are organizations. I mean, certainly, we have seen organizations that overhype this stuff, and that does a disservice to the real science of it. So that plays into it too. But by and large, this is public service you guys are doing, and it's science.
Yes.
And science things can change in a moment. It's not like, oh, we know what this is going to be. Now, I guess explain for the average person, because there are long-term, you mentioned earlier, long-term forecasts where for instance, you'll do the winter forecast, Eric, or you'll do where what the season is overall likely to be like. And I don't know if people understand, how can you do that? Or how can they say, oh, it's likely to be an active hurricane season, but then you can't tell me what it's going to be like for, my kid's graduation this July.
Yeah.
Right?
Two completely different kinds of forecasts, that's for sure. Long-range forecasts are based on temperatures and precipitation compared to normal and things like that. Can we tell you it's going to rain on July 27th at 8 p.m.? No way. Can we, with some degree of certainty, say what the flavor of the summer is going to be? Yes, same thing with the winter forecast. We can't say it's going to snow on February 22nd, but we can say, hey, it's likely to be a less snowy than average winter. Those are very different types of forecasts than the forecast we do every day on TV, saying chance of rain tomorrow's high is between 6 and 8 p.m., high 78. Those are two completely different things, but that's one of the challenges, certainly, communicating those kinds of different forecasts to the public. They're all the same, to a lot of the public anyway, they're all the same, but they are very, very different.
We show a map a lot, those 8 to 14 day or the 6 to 10 day outlooks, long range outlooks from Climate Prediction Center. And there's a way you have to read those, because if you see, like on the temperature map, if you see oranges and reds, you think, oh, it's going to be hot. Well, not necessarily, because over that period, if the high temperatures work out to be even 1 degree above the average, then that forecast verifies. So we're not telling you how much above normal or below normal it's going to be. We're telling you the odds that the pattern overall is going to be above or below normal.
Yeah, so if you see the deep oranges on that temperature map, that doesn't mean hot, hot, hot. It means there's good chances it'll be warmer than average.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
And by the way, the stats show that you guys are right far more often than you're not,
Yes, absolutely.
despite anybody's snide remarks.
It is. We talk about some of these little nuanced misconceptions about weather forecasters and meteorologists. The kind of at a baseline, the perception for a lot of people is that, we're weather guessers and we're never right and things like that. And yeah, it couldn't be farther from the truth. A lot of people's misconceptions about weather forecasting date back to the 1950s, when things weren't very good in terms of forecasting the weather. Things have changed a lot since then. So are there days that the atmosphere wins and we, don't get all the details right? Absolutely. But the analogy I like to use on that is the best baseball players in Major League Baseball are successful about 35% of the time. We get the forecast right way, way more often than that.
I want to talk a little bit, just backpedaling to public perception and forecasting severe weather, and the mindset that people should have when they go into a potential severe weather threat day. Around here, you talked about people have angst, and a lot of it is because they were here on May 31st, 1985. Yes. You want to talk about a day when all of the ingredients for the cake came together, that they all came together that day, and that's what we call in the business a generational outbreak, a generational event. And, even that day, there was, of course, this was 40 years ago but, you had, at the beginning of the day, a significant forecast potential from the folks at SPC, which was NSSL, or whatever it was called then. But in the middle of the afternoon, all of the stuff was happening up in southern Ontario. Nothing was happening down here yet, about 3:30 in the afternoon. So when they issued their 3:30 p.m. outlook, they dropped the risk from moderate to slight. And then about 15 minutes after that, the cap broke and everything, all hell broke loose. And so you had all the planets kind of lining up for, because usually, if we see severe weather around here, it's something we follow all across the state. It develops out toward Toledo or toward, western Ohio, and it moves across. This stuff blew up east of Cleveland very, very quickly. A couple of bands of these supercell storms, and these were unlike any kind of storms that we normally see around here. So, you know, I hate to keep referencing that, but you know, the fact of the matter is, if the conditions are in place, that kind of outbreak can happen anywhere at any time.
How do you keep up on the fact that obviously weather is also, I don't want to say less predictable because that's tramping on your guys' territory, but certainly it's changed. I mean, the climate has changed. There's no question that there are more different things that happen now than happened 10 years ago even.
Sure.
Yeah.
So how do you evolve with that?
It's a challenge for sure. Now our local climate change impacts are not as great as a place like Miami due to rising sea levels, and even New York City and places that are near oceans have the biggest impacts thus far from climate change. But around here, it's certainly manifested itself in more kind of weird precipitation events where we get just freak floods more often than we used to. Some of that is just a roll of the dice, it's random chance, but some of it is certainly, you could say, is climate change related. And so we have to, kind of, again, thread the needle between saying, that heavy rain event that resulted in that weird flooding that you used to see once in every 40 years, now we're seeing once every 5 or 10 years. That individual flood, was that because of climate change? No, we can't say it was because directly of climate change, but we try to communicate that climate change loads the dice. It changes the odds of weird, significant weather events. It's kind of like, again, to use another baseball analogy, all the best baseball players in the late 90s were on steroids. Every home run they hit wasn't because they were on steroids. Some of those home runs would have happened anyway, but because they were on steroids, the chances of any one pitch being hit a million miles into the stands was definitely higher. So
Sure.
It's kind of the same thing.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And the only thing that I can add to that is, we have these freak events like he was talking about. I was on the air for the January 2019 tornado in Trumbull County, the dead of winter.
Dead of winter.
I'm here, anticipating, a couple of gusty thunderstorms up in the weather office, and then I start watching the radar and I see this rotation signature has really got some staying power to it. I'm like, are they going to warn this thing? And then obviously, like I said, we get an actual tornado January 8th or 10th or whatever it was.
Middle of January.
Yeah, it was. I personally have never seen a confirmed tornado in January in this part of the country.
Yep.
Is there anything we haven't touched on that you guys want to make sure everybody knows? I'm sure there's a lot.
Yeah.
Just be nice to us. Our thin gets, or our skin, I should say, gets really thick in this business because otherwise you just couldn't survive. But it's always nice to hear from viewers. As much as we have focused a little bit on some of the misconceptions and frustrations that we have, viewers are actually, for the most part, really, really nice to us, and we never get tired of people coming up to us in person or via email or Facebook and telling us, hey, you really helped us get through that situation. Your calm presence was really helpful, and we really appreciate it. And the more we hear that, the more it helps us to understand that, hey, we're doing the right thing when we're not going crazy with every weather event and being too excited about things. So it helps remind us that we're on the right track.
Much like we talk about in news, I mean, we don't sell empty boxes.
Yep.
So it's the same here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you asked the question of what goes on in the weather office, when you're looking into one of these severe weather events. We've got every possible avenue checked. We've got our internal line with the National Weather Service that we're always communicating with them. We have hourly data that's coming in that we're watching so we can pick up on any short-term trends. I mean, when there is a severe weather situation, it is an all hands and all eyes on deck thing, and we don't stop watching that until the threat is completely over out of our area. So just know that when you see us on TV or you see us make a forecast about severe weather, that we are constantly, going through this stuff with a fine-tooth comb, and we're not just, sitting there with our feet up, just, waiting for something to happen.
The great thing about doing this in the 21st century is there's no shortage of things to look at. In fact, some days there's too much stuff to look at.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can look at too many things and kind of get lost in the forest a little bit. But it's amazing the stuff we have at our disposal these days.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you guys for being with us. As always, if you have any news tips, it's news at WFMJ.com, watchdog at WFMJ.com. Our newsroom is 330-744-8821. There's also weather at WFMJ.com, and they particularly, you know, when you got pictures to send us or anything, you know, you're probably not going to have a weather tip that they don't already know about, so that's a little bit different. In the meantime, I've got to call my wife and say we should cancel our plans for July 27th at 8 p.m. because Eric can't guarantee whether it's going to be raining.
Can't guarantee it. Nope.
We'll be back next week. Thank you very much. This has been The Outcue.